Today's episode is brought to you by knitCompanion. knitCompanion is a groundbreaking app that works with any pattern. With its patented tools, specially designed by fiber artists for fiber artists, it keeps track so your hands and mind can focus on making beautiful things. See the show notes to this episode for a special offer. Thank you so much, knitCompanion. And now, here's the show. Welcome to episode 275 of the Craft Industry Alliance podcast. I'm Abby Glassenberg. Craft Industry Alliance is a community for craft professionals where you can strengthen your creative business, stay up to date on industry news, and build connections within our supportive trade association. Check it out at craftindustryalliance.org. Today on the show, we're talking about publishing books with my guest, Deborah Balmuth. Deborah retired from Storey Publishing on September 30th after 31 years with the company. She began as an editor, becoming editorial director in 2003 and publisher in 2013. She especially enjoyed expanding Storey's library of craft and herbal titles, working with authors including Helen Hiebert, Saffiyah Talley, Pearl-McPhee, Kari Chapin, Thomas Knauer, Megumi Inyoue, Rosemary Gladstar, and Shannon Downey, to name a few. In her retirement, she's looking forward to becoming a consumer of Storey books with days filled with crafting, cooking, and making. Deborah Balmuth, welcome.
Thank you. So nice to be here.
Yeah, and you were on episode 47 of this show, which we recorded live at Craftcation in 2015, April 2015. So it's been almost 10 years. And at that point, I hadn't launched Craft Industry Alliance yet. We were just sort of in the planning stages. And you and I talked all about craft publishing. We talked about working with an agent. We talked about writing compelling proposals, all of the sort of nitty gritty of becoming a craft book author. And so that was a great conversation. I will link in the show notes to that one if people want to go back. But now it's been 10 years. And of course, things have changed. And here you are retiring from so long with Storey Publishing. So I really want this episode to be about a reflection back on what has changed from your vantage point, because I think you have such a unique vantage point having worked with craft books for so long. So let's just briefly go back, though, to sort of your history and how you got to Storey in the first place, so people have a way to sort of understand the context here.
Yeah. Well, I started working at Storey in 1993, soon after I had moved to the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. And I had lived in the Boston area before that and had some experience working for a very small book publisher. And then I had worked in publications at Boston University and done a variety of publications related work. But I was just, I moved out here to be with my now husband, and I had no idea that there was a book publishing company out here. So I was really thrilled to discover Storey was out here. And at the time that I joined, they were 10 years old. They started in 1983, and it was owned by and started by Martha and John Storey, who were a couple who were very engaged in gardening, especially. And they really wanted to be in a location where they could be doing the things that the books that they were publishing were about. So they were, so that was the location in Western Massachusetts, and in Southern Vermont actually was their original address. But they were doing a lot of gardening books. They were doing a lot of backyard animal raising and small scale farming, and really kind of what they would call self-sufficiency at that time. And it was interesting when I was thinking back on it, all the books were one color, a lot of them were just standard trim sizes, 6x9, 8.5x11, illustrated books. And the company actually had a very small publishing line, a book publishing line. Their main focus, they had an advertising arm where they were selling there was like these card decks that you used to get in the mail that were selling all these gardening materials and gardening companies. And so they had an in-house ad agency that really supported and floated the boat for the books. The books were a small part of what they did, and I've been reflecting on this more because I didn't really realize that. But now that I've retired, as in my retirement, and started looking back at what I had done at Storey, and I had this feeling of like, oh my God, they were letting me just run wild when I started acquiring. Like in 1995, I started getting ideas of like, I'd like to start acquiring books, and I I realized that the book program was pretty wide open. It was a fairly small list that they had, and it was really focused on gardening and backyard building and kind of self sufficiency skills, preserving, and some cooking books, but um, very little in the craft line. There were books on timber frame building and that kind of thing, but very little in the craft line per se. And so, and one of the things I noticed was uh, and I learned this early on, is just kind of beginning to develop my intuition about what was happening in the culture and how that related to what we might publish. And so I was noticing that a lot of the gardeners were getting interested in herbs, and that there was a kind of interest in herbs that was growing. This was like in the in the mid early to mid 1990s. And so I noticed that Frontier Herb was having an herb conference, and they're the company that has the bulk herbs in natural food stores. There's always a stand of it, and it was out in Iowa, which is where their headquarters are. So I said to John Storey, if I can just get a ticket and fly to Iowa, I could take my tent. There's camping there, and it won't cost you anything. It was simple. It was like $150 to register for this weekend of herb talks out in these fields under tents. So that was it became kind of a joke at Storey, like that was the cheapest travel expenditure that he'd ever seen, a request for travel, because I took my tent. The tents were pitched so close to each other that it was like the snoring was traveling through the ground at night. But that was where I just got excited about all these herbalists that were making herbal remedies and doing herbal crafts and talking about medicinal herbs. And I just started walking up to people and giving them my card and saying, if you're interested in writing a book, I'd love to talk to you. And that's where I first connected with Rosemary Gladstar, who had a line of self-published little books on herbs, herbs for children's health and herbs for stress and well-being. And she had all these little recipes that she had developed, which is what she was really well known for. And that's how we started our relationship with her, was creating books, larger book versions out of these booklets that she had started. So, and that's what really got me going about in publishing too. And then in the craft area, it's funny, I recently, we were doing another book just as I was leaving, we were working on another book with Helen Hiebert, a paper maker. And we were remembering, and this is before, the other thing is, it's before, it's just the very beginnings of even using email, let alone, social media. And so I used to do things like look at the list of classes from all kinds of schools, and the New York Botanical Garden was one that I looked at, and Helen was teaching a class there on creating paper from plants, weeds and plants, common weeds and plants. And so I remember writing her a letter and closing some sample books and sending it to her. She remembers this. And it was like, that was how we started our relationship. And what grew out of that was the first book that she did with us was paper making with plants. And then subsequently we did a paper maker's companion. And it was really the beginnings of a strong interest in paper making as well. So that, just getting in at the beginning of some of these trends and interests and crafters. Another example was the very first book we did on herbs was a book that came in as an unsolicited manuscript called the Herbal Body Book from Stephanie Turles, who ended up doing a lot of recipe books with us. But this was books on making your own skincare products. And then we got a manuscript for a book on making natural soap from Susan Miller Cavage. And I got that manuscript. It just came in unsolicited. And I was like, oh, soap making. This is interesting. And so we did the natural soap book, which became a bestseller and really one of the first books on making soap from scratch. And subsequently we went deep into the soap making area and did a lot of different soap making books. And that was another thing that I liked about Storey, was because we were kind of category focused this way, that when we'd find a topic and we'd find the audience for it, we could go deep into exploring that area. Part of this
Yeah.
was,
And it's,
yeah,
I
go
mean, I
ahead.
was just going to say, it sounds
Yeah,
like a big part of this for you is sort of being in touch with the cultural zeitgeist, like understanding, keeping your eyes open and seeing what is bubbling up. What do you see over and over? What, seems very new and exciting, and sort of just kind of always having your eyes open in that way.
yeah, yeah. It's very much in the recent weeks when I was getting ready to retire, the other editors kept saying to me, "Well, tell us what your process is, and tell us." And I was like, it's hard to explain because a lot of it is an intuitive kind of process of reading everything. I mean, that was one, being curious is one thing. I kind of wrote a list of tips as I was leaving. I was like, be open, be curious, read widely. You never know where an idea is going to come from. And like I was saying, I was reading lists of workshops that were being offered, as well as ideas came from everywhere, at that stage, and through my whole career there. Um, and trying to be the reader was a big part of it, going through the world with my eyes open to, like, what would I want to see? And I think that's where the crafts, especially, it worked really well for me because of my own interest in crafts. And so um, yeah, and so then things started to, as things started to change in the culture, I started to see different things emerging in terms of the interest in things that we were publishing. And I do,
Mm-hmm.
one of the examples that I remember, and I might have mentioned that, I didn't go back and listen to our original conversation 10 years ago, but um, I remember reading reading a blog post about somebody knitting a project with one skein of yarn. And I had
Mm-hmm.
this moment. It was like this light bulb moment. I walked out and I said to Gwen Steege, who was our craft editor at that time, who worked with me closely, I said, do you think there could be a whole book of projects that are all use one skein of yarn? And that's when our One Skein Wonders series started, and then we expanded this idea, and well, it could be a community, because that was the whole thing that was happening with the blogs, was this sense of a craft community building and people exchanging ideas. And this was before Ravelry and before patterns were so readily available online, but there were a lot of people that were selling their individual patterns in print, at through their local fabrics yarn store, or when they did workshops. So we sent out an invitation and said, if you'd like to submit your project to be considered for inclusion in this book, and we decided it would be 101 projects. And um, that was, that really became the beginning of that One Skein series, which I think we ended up with, I don't know, 8 or 9 books in the series, and then we went on and did it with One Yard, and
Mm-hmm.
in the fabric world. And so that sense of being in touch with what's going on in the community, and that was really what happened. And in the culture, what happened with Kari Chapin as well, that she came to me and
Mm-hmm.
she said, I have this idea of, writing a book for all these crafters that are starting to sell on this thing called Etsy. And you know, and I thought, I don't know if this is a book that would have, would last for very long, and would it get dated very quickly. But again, we were able to really, in the development of the book and working with her, to make it a very practical and in-depth guide, so that it did last for quite a while. And then she did an update of it actually too. But having that sense of, like, being able to take the risk a little bit is interesting. I just finished reading a book called The Editor, which is a biography of Judith Jones, she was the cookbook editor at Knauer for a long time, and she discovered Julia Child, and she discovered, and then I was just loving reading it because it really resonated for me with this sense of just trusting your gut a little bit. She had lived in France. When she was right out of college, and she had been interested in French cooking, and then this manuscript comes along, and the people are so the other people in the publishing company are skeptical, and she's like, "No, I really think that And it was a time of of the feminine mystique and women's liberation, and fast food. And it's like, I don't know if people really want to. They were saying, I don't think that people really want to spend that time learning how to cook, to do French cooking. And she said, "Oh no, this is a whole, it was a whole empowering experience," and bringing Julia Child forward. And then she got a manuscript that was from a young woman who was in film school, and it was all vegetarian recipes. And she ended up shaping it was Anna Thomas, and she ended up shaping that into the vegetarian epicure. This was in the 1970, but it really resonated with me, of that sense of just having a sense of what's going on in the culture, and having a taking a risk on, like, I think this is the edge of something, because I found that that's really important, is being able to get out early with an idea, and being a leader in it too. Um, and I was thinking about some of the things that we did. I think I mentioned the knitting, which was something that we had always wanted to do, but always thought it was too narrow an audience. And then we started to get a sense of that there's this younger audience that is really interested in knitting, and that was how we, took the plunge into knitting. And then in the kids area, we started getting a sense of the skills for kids, and so that's when we started the sewing school, which was another one that came to me as an unsolicited manuscript, but seeing it and thinking, oh, this could be really interesting, and then building on that with a cooking class book for kids, and then getting more into the fiber crafts and building and nature observation as for kids as well. So,
And did you ever have like a feeling of resistance? I mean, I feel like, when you're used to things being a certain way in a particular craft or a particular area. And then somebody's doing something new, sharing information in a new way,
mhm.
making projects that are simpler, making it easier for other people to access it. There can be some kind of a feeling of resentment, like I had to learn it the hard way, and now these kids today are doing it the easy way, or they're sharing this information that I had, it was hard won for me to get. You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
feeling of like it's changing and I want it to stay the same. I don't know if you personally ever felt that way, or like encountered other people who you had to convince to do a book or take on a new project because they had that feeling of like, that's not for us to share. This is not the traditional way that this has been done.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to think about that. It was. I think I encountered it more often with potential authors of, well, I'm not sure I want to give away my secrets.
Yes.
I'm not sure that I want to share what. And would say things like, well, and they're like, I have a business doing this,
Hmm.
and I don't really want to share and and yet I did sense that that there was this change going on in the craft community that obviously has just burgeoned, and that Craft Industry Alliance is an example of it, of sharing, of the sense of there being plenty of abundance, but I would say to authors, well, it actually makes them appreciate potential authors. I think it makes people appreciate your work even more, and you'd be surprised how many people are like, well, I tried that. I tried making that, and yeah, it came out okay. But then I went and bought one from the person that that had written the book, because there was it gave me a greater appreciation for what they did. So I think you're right that there was a real sense of there was reluctance sometimes on sharing. Um, and I think I learned a lot about this from the herbal community too, because there was a lot of sense of Rosemary Gladstar especially had a strong sense of this is this belongs to the people. This is folk medicine. This is not, nobody owns these recipes. This has been passed down from person to person. And that's why we're here, is to keep sharing it. And that's is how, and I think in the herbal community, so much of it was shared kind of orally because there wasn't as much, publication in that area. But it is interesting to think about it in the craft area of, of whether there was resistance there.
I want to take a minute now to speak with our sponsor, Sally Holt from knitCompanion.
My name is Sally Holt, and I'm the creator of the knitting app called knitCompanion.
And tell me what knitCompanion is all about.
Yeah, so it's really a tool that's available on all your electronic devices that makes it a whole lot easier to keep track of where you are in the pattern. And we've really tried to design the tool so that it takes care of tracking all the different things that you need to do at the same time and where you are in the pattern, so that you can really focus on your knitting and your craft, and whether that's just enjoying what you're making or really focusing and concentrating on learning a new technique. We really try to take that whole tracking out of the picture so you can focus on what you're doing.
And how is this different from, like, say, a PDF reader?
A PDF reader is going to show you the pattern, and it's even going to give you some really basic tools, like you can draw on it and write on it. But even the tools that you might use, like a highlighter box or something to keep track of where you are, they're a little bit clumsy to use in a PDF reader. And then knitCompanion is going to do a whole bunch of stuff with your pattern because it kind of understands a lot of concepts in patterns. It's going to be able to do a whole lot of stuff with your pattern that a PDF reader can't even imagine, because it's kind of just a very generic way of looking at a document.
And what are one or two of the cool things that you found that people really like about knitCompanion?
We've got a couple of things that are just really unique in the app. For example, the app has artificial intelligence built into it, so it can actually identify the charts in your pattern. It can find all of the rows and stitches that are in that chart. And then once it understands that that's a knitting chart, it can give you a whole range of tools that you really won't get anywhere else. So it can give you a row marker, of course, so that you can see where you are. Because it can now identify all the different stitches in the chart, it can find all your SSKs and make them the color of your choice, or your knit two togethers and make them a different color. On a color work chart, it can find all the red stitches and make them blue, and tell you how many there are in a stretch, so you don't have to keep stopping to count the stitches. You can play with different color combinations in that chart motif before you swatch, and then, kind of pick what works for you. And all of a sudden, you have a chart that matches the yarn that you've chosen, the colors match, and you're getting stitch counts.
Tell us where we can go to get this magical knitCompanion.
So it's available in the app store. So you can get it from Google Play, you can get it from the Amazon App Store, you can get it from the Apple App Store. So it's really available in all of those places. It's actually free to download and use with the basics, which is going to be a little bit more than you get with a regular PDF reader, because it'll have counters and some other, fun knitterly functions kind of built into the basics. And then it's $30 a year for an annual subscription for all of these more advanced, really specific crafting functions that I've been talking about.
Thank you so much, Sally. And now back to our conversation with Deborah. Yeah. I remember when Craftsy and Creative Bug and the online, education websites, popped up in the 2010-12, that time period. Yeah. There was a lot of that resentment feeling, especially among, shop owners who felt that, if this person who we've brought in as a special guest teacher, goes on one of these websites and teaches the same thing, then they're never gonna, want to come to our store, or people are never going to want to pay to come take a class with them at our store because they've already watched it online. And in fact, I think as time went by, what we saw was that watching a person teach on Craftsy or Creative Bug only made you want to see them in person more. And a book is the same way, but I can understand that immediate feeling of don't do it. Don't give away your secrets. But in fact, when you do give them away, you actually build an audience who's more devoted.
Yeah. And I saw it the other way around too. When I'd bring proposals to our publishing committee of like, well, if they're teaching this, why would somebody want a book on it? And I think we proved that often, as you know, when you take a class, you're like, well, I wish I want to remember all of this and I'd like to go deeper into it. And a book is the perfect takeaway for that, of a refresher on the technique and being able to keep on expanding your knowledge. I mean, that's where I see what I loved about doing, DIY books that really, and instructional books, is that the book itself is it's like a launching pad for the creativity, and for the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I think is unique about Storey is your back catalog. So your books stayed in print in a way that books published with other craft publishers in particular didn't necessarily. So maybe talk a little bit about that and the implications of something like that.
Yeah. Well, and that was really a model. It was a publishing model and a business model, really. And different publishers have different models of the one way to make money is to publish a lot of books every year and just keep increasing the number of books that you're publishing. Another way, which was more what Storey did, was let's try to create books that really stand the test of time. And so techniques that really won't get dated quickly. And let's do the technique as in depth as possible and Storey basically fell into a pattern of pretty much doing 35 to 40 books a year. And then really, once the model was, after the first year of sales, you've covered your development costs, the costs of editing and the design and the printing of the book. And then if you keep it in print you just keep on, that becomes a real moneymaker for both the company and the author if it continues to sell. And basically the cost is the cost of continuing to reprint it. So, but it also affected the kinds of books that we acquired and the way we edited them, because we weren't looking for something that was sometimes people would come with ideas that were very trendy, and it's like, I
remember going to Michael's one year, and there were 4 new books from 4 different publishers on making paracord bracelets.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of thing of just like, is this going to be lasting? Or how would you make a book? Sometimes I would think, how could we make a book that would have that could be that could be more timeless on this topic? Or is there a possibility of that? Or is it, is it a trend that you do a book and you sell it for a year or two and then it's out of print? So, so Storey, I think, has something like 600 books in the backlist, something like that. And it's just keeps on. And that's the other part of it. The other thing that we would do is periodically look at the backlist and say, are there books here that have sold steadily, although are seeing declining sales because they're starting to get dated? So things like, if sometimes authors would come to us and say, you know what, I have some, I think of one, the Knitting Answer book that Margaret Radcliffe did. And I think after it was out about 10 years, she said, I've got a lot more questions that students have asked me, and I could expand the book. So then we have an opportunity to do a second edition and reintroduce the book and kind of revive the sales again. And sometimes even going back and completely redesigning a book. I was so excited that just as I was leaving, there was a book that I had edited in I think it was 1995 or 96, on making bentwood trellises. And it was with Jim Long, who was an herbalist, who had a farm, and he made these rustic trellises and from foraged materials. But we didn't make a big deal of it being foraged materials at the time, because foraging the part of it was really making the trellises. But the book wasn't in full color because we didn't have the capacity at that time to print 4-color books. So we pulled it out of the vault of the back, as we called it, where we kept all the old books because it had been out of print. And I was like, with the interest in foraging and the interest in cottage gardening and rustic furnishings continues to be. It's kind of an everlasting thing. So they were doing a whole new full color version of it, and went to Jim's farm. We found him, and he was still active. He made new trellises. He had sent a photographer there, and so it's really fun to see that happen.
And I have to say, like, as an artist, that feels so good because I've written a few books, and my first book went out of print, and I could have updated. I would have been thrilled to have updated. I would have been thrilled for it to still be in print, but that was it. And now my second book is in limbo. They say it's not out of print, but we're not printing it anymore. So that's, I don't know. And the company was sold. It's just sort of like, and I love that book, but again, it's becoming harder and harder to get copies of it. And so, I think as a person who's devoted to a craft, to have a publisher stand by it in that way, and then really, just stand by it over its longevity and come back to you and say, we still love this and we want to reintroduce it. Would you come back to it? Would just be such an honor.
Yeah. And I think it's getting harder. It was getting harder for Storey, as I was leaving. I think that the expectation of what are realistic sales for a book that's been out for 10 years. But that's the other part of being a backlist, as we said, publisher publishing for the long run is, yes, the sales may be smaller year after year by year, but they're steady and they continue, so that maybe it's not selling 30,000 copies a year, but it's selling 3,000 or 5,000 copies a year, and it's doing it year after year. And having that patience, it's hard, and I think that the changes in publishing and what I had seen, Storey had been independent Storey was independent until year 2000, when it was acquired by Workman, which was one of the largest independent publishers. And that was actually a very positive change for Storey. The distribution was broader because Workman had a bigger sales group. And because Workman was independent, they were willing to both invest in Storey, and they also had a similar model of really believing in keeping books in print for a long time and putting a lot into each book, and not trying to do too many books, but doing a small number of books really well. That was a good match for Storey, and that for 20 years with Workman as an independent company, Storey really grew, and had an opportunity, had a lot of support. In 2021, when the Workman family, Peter Workman had died, and the Workman family no longer wanted to carry on the company, and that was when they started looking for a new home for the company, and they sold it to Hachette, which is one of the big 5 publishers that not everyone knows the name Hachette, but when you say Little Brown, they're like, oh, that's a company that owns Little Brown and Grand Central, and they own Running Press. And I was seeing in the last 3 years that I was there, as a seeing this transition, it was an education for the Workman division to educate the Hachette sales group about what backlist publishing was about, really, because they're primarily a fiction house. And fiction, a popular fiction, especially it's published, I think they have some of the same issues, but a lot of it is written to sell for 2 or 3 years. And then the assumption is, okay, it'll go out of print, and there'll be another book by James Patterson, who's one of their authors, so that they have, it's a very different model. And and the expectation for sales and the expectation for what's reasonable to look at for keeping a book in print becomes different too. And that was an educational process that is still going on. But I think Workman was making some progress when I left. But it's one of the challenges with the consolidation that's happening, I think, in publishing,
which is massive.
It is massive. I think a lot of what happened with Workman is not unusual. That there's a lot of smaller, the independent publishers have been bought by the ones that have been successful, like Workman, are very attractive to these larger companies. But suddenly, there's a lot. Storybooks are being sold in a pool of 1,000 or 1,500 other new books that are coming out every year. So the other part is continuing to find those specialty markets that Storey and Workman had always focused on, like getting books into craft stores and herb shops and garden centers and the places. That was another thing that was unique has always been about Storey's business, and that John and Martha Storey had a model of, let's get the books into the places where people are buying the supplies, where the people who are enthusiasts for these topics are going. They may not always be going into bookstores. So that was one of the early parts of their business model as well.
And I know that it wasn't with you directly, but it was with maybe one of your editors or other staff members I had met with to work on thinking about diversifying the author base at one point. Right. And I don't remember exactly how many years ago this was, but it sounded as though there was some talk and concerted effort to say, let's look at who we're publishing and let's make sure that it's reflective of the audience that's consuming books. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about what, was going on behind the scenes then and how you went about trying to diversify the author list.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, I think that, it comes back to a little bit when I was talking about this kind of intuitive sense of what's, what are the trends or what's going on in the culture, and where do I find authors that are passionate about those and are engaged in those activities. And so I was talking about going to herb conferences and go to craft conferences and shows, but I think we started to realize there's a big part of the community that we're not seeing there, that there are different places, and that whole thing of who's in my network and who isn't in my network. It was really when we started digging into it and realizing we're not reaching all of the people that are in our community and all the potential, members of our, of the community. So, we have made an ongoing effort to really find more authors of color, authors that are in different areas, different cultures, coming from different cultural backgrounds. And it's been really fun. It's really enriched the books that we're doing, and also expanded the network that the editors had, that I had, and that the editors have, because one person leads to another, and suddenly you discover, oh my God, there's these big communities of knitters of color and people that are doing really interesting, and other voices, obviously, that deserve to be elevated. It's what I always talk about, finding authors who, and that was part of what we always did at Storey too, was finding authors who were real doers and finding these communities of people that we hadn't reached. And that's an ongoing effort, but it's really enriched our books a lot.
And is it still worthwhile for a maker out there to write a craft book? This was a question that I think I asked you back in when we had our last interview in 2015. But of course, 10 years has gone by, and I guess it depends on how you define the word worthwhile. But what are your thoughts? If you were mentoring a younger person today who was sort of just getting their career in crafting in some way launched, would you say to them, yes, do this, or wait and do it later, or no, actually don't spend your time doing this?
I think it depends on what your craft is and who you want to, what your desire is, what your intent is. I've talked to people who are doing very specialized crafts and have a small community of people that they're in touch with, that they're teaching it to. And I think about, well, are there ways of sharing it? I mean, do you want to do a self-published booklet that you print a couple hundred copies of and that you're able to share? I mean, I think that there's value in putting what you're doing into print. Whether you try to do it with a commercial publisher or not, that I think is something to really think about, because as you said, there's disappointments in that. There's potential disappointments, and it's, but at the same time, it's like if 5,000 people found your book and got a lot out of it, that's 5,000 people who might not have been reached. You might not have reached any other way. So that still feels like a success to me, even though the publisher may not say that's a success. But so I think that it's hard to say, yes, it's important. And there's it's an incredible amount of work. Writing a book is hard work. And so, and I think I probably said
writing a good book is even harder work.
Yes, you're right. And I think that, and as I always said at Storey, it's a partnership too, so that there's a lot of work that the author does in preparing the manuscript, and then there's a whole other piece of it of working with the publisher in getting the photography done and all the editing, and really, and so there's a lot of investment on both ends, and making sure that that feels worthwhile for everybody involved, I think, is an important thing to think about. I probably said this because I always said it to authors. I'm like, if you're trying to make a living, this is not the way to go. It's really not. That's not a reason to write a book, is to make money. It's really got to be an extension of yourself and the message that you want to share with the world, or with, and with the message or the craft or the technique that you want to share, your creativity that you want to share. But there are other ways of doing that. And I think I saw that when I would approach a lot of authors who were, as you were saying, doing workshops, doing videos, having had wonderful online platforms, and they didn't feel the need to have a book, because they really were reaching people. There are so many different ways of reaching your audience now too, I think. So,
yeah. And there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with being able to say, okay, well, it takes a year to write a book, let's say, because more or less it does take a year to write a book. And a lot of times you can't also produce other things that are going to make money during that time. In other words, take on freelance work, or develop new self-published patterns, or travel around the world teaching, or whatever it might be. Even, making new content for your YouTube channel. It's going to be challenging to do that and write the book. So in some ways, it means taking a year off from producing new money-making things to make this book, which is really a privilege that many people don't have. And so it kind of in some ways limits who can even to undertake something like this.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And I think, you're also making me think, I think it's very hard to write a book at the beginning of your career too. If you're just beginning, I would say a book is it's not the most effective way to break through. It really isn't. And there's more and more focus on authors doing their own publicity too, or bringing the audience to bringing the sales potential to the book. That the publisher's publicity group can't do as much as you can do if you have a strong social media platform, or other ways, or a strong teaching schedule, a lot of other ways of reaching people. So I think the point a question of what point you're at your career, as you said too, and other things that are really are both making money for you and also helping you, are very satisfying for you, is part of the decision too about whether writing a book is the right thing.
And I think about, what I advise potential authors. I always say to them, like, this is a partnership. So what you bring to the table is equally of value to what the publishing company or even the fabric company or whatever you're partnering with brings to the table. And it might not be the same financial investment, right? So the company may be bringing, $25,000 worth of printing and distribution power that you're not bringing. You're not bringing in $25,000 in financial investment, but without you, there is no book.
Right.
So what you're bringing is a special, unique set of skills and talents to produce the content that sells the book and earns back the $25,000 investment.
Right.
And so you really need to see it as an equal partnership in that way, rather than sort of seeing them being in charge and you doing what they say, so that you end up with a product that you're proud of, because then you're going to be much more likely, as you said, to try to sell it through your channels.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's your name on the book, and I always have said that to authors. It's like, I think, there used to be a sense of like, well, the publicity department will, and the sales department will sell my book. And it's like, they actually are there to back you up, but you're still the lead voice on the book, both for sales and publicity.
Yeah. And I went through this. I feel like the 2010s, a lot of authors were really upset about that, feeling as though the publishing companies weren't doing their side of the deal when it came to publicity, and that they were expected to sell their own book. And I think now people have more have sort of accepted that as the way things are going to be. And in fact, maybe the pendulum has swung too far, which is to say some people get deals with publishers and other partners, not because they have a really unique voice or talent or set of skills, but because they have 100,000 Instagram followers.
Exactly.
And that doesn't necessarily really lead to a quality product.
Right. No, I agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's hard to see.
It is hard to see. And that was part of what I was, as in the recent years is because there's that expectation of that when you go to sales conference and say, we've got this book that you're going to say, and the author has this huge platform, and there's so many worthy authors that don't always have that big platform, but have the most interesting material to share.
Right. Yeah. And that's tough. So in 2015, I was looking back at the interview questions that I asked you. And one of them was, and I thought this was interesting that I asked this. I asked, are you finding that people are willing to pay for a digital book what they would pay for a print book? What needs to happen in the digital realm for high quality publishing to thrive there? I think maybe we were at that stage where it was like the iPad and people were going to get all their magazines on the iPad. Do you remember this phase?
Right.
And that was right at that moment. So I was like, digital books, is this going to be a thing? What do you think about that question now? What happened?
I think that digital, ebooks have become just another format that's available. I think that, especially in the craft books Storey releases an ebook of every book at the same time that it releases the print book, and some of them do better than others. But we never saw a really strong uptick in digital publishing.
Mm-hmm. It didn't happen.
I think part of it was making a real focus on making the book as a special object itself. I think that what we've seen in craft publishing that was so exciting in the last, I was thinking about it, in the last 5 to 7 years or so was, some of those early books that I worked on, a lot of the focus was on creating a product, that it was like, you make paper, you make soap. And then I think that there's been a so much of a movement towards craft as self-expression and creativity. And the book and within that, as Storey was publishing these craft books, the book itself being an expression of creativity. So that one of the books I think about that I loved that we did, there was in recently, or in the last, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, Christy Johnson's book Mystical Stitches. And the art director she was just immersed in that. I don't know if you remember, the outside of the book has Christy embroidered it. And then the inside, they photographed the backside of her embroidery, which was just gorgeous. And then, but Christy they actually planned out the book so that they actually photographed. Christy did her sampler embroidery on the piece of fabric that was exactly the size of the page of the book. And so that the plan was to photograph and to have the type was designed and written just to fit within the pages of interspersed with the stitching. And I have to say, her new book, The Art of Embroidery Design, which I think is coming out in April, I saw an early copy and it's just absolutely as gorgeous. But so that you don't get that in a digital book. I mean, the feeling of the book itself as a creative piece that really is an expression of the author's creativity. I think is
and so really, maybe the reaction to not just digital books, but to the internet in general as a way to distribute how-to content has been that books have become art objects in and of themselves in many ways. And that's what keeps them special and worth buying. And, I feel like a book like that, you go to Anthropology, right? And it's so beautifully merchandised. And there's all of these beautiful objects and clothing and jewelry and books. And a book like that, not that one's necessarily there, but you get what I'm saying. Like, it becomes a way to style your home. An object that you want to display and touch and have out. And I think even the independent craft magazines, the ad-free uppercase, quilt folk magazines, were part of that same reaction, which is to say, like, the printed object becomes even more precious in the digital age. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, all right. Anything that we didn't talk about your time at Storey that you want to make sure we talk about?
One of the things I'd been thinking about that I was just talking about was the change in in craft publishing. I think that transition to craft as a creative, as an act of self-realization is really important. And the other part of that I was thinking about too is the whole burgeoning of the illustration market and how that's changed so much, of illustrators becoming so much more prominent. And I saw that part of what we did in Storey's books was illustration becoming a much more prominent part of our books, even if it wasn't a craft book. But I mean, one of the ones that I think about are Julia Rothman's books, the Farm Anatomy and the Wildlife Anatomy most recently. That idea of art and illustration as a visual presentation and communication of information. I think that wouldn't have happened. That was a real change in the whole art community that was happening, and it was really exciting to think about how to integrate that into Storey's publishing program in our craft books, but also in our kids' books, especially. But then even it was really fun to be able to do that with books like Julia's books.
Yeah. So it's really about visual presentation, self-expression. Right. Yeah. I think those are such interesting trends to notice in craft publishing and maybe a way forward as we think about what's coming next. So I want to make sure we get to your recommendations. So you have a couple of recommendations. Not all of them are books. But the first one it's Shannon Downey's new book, Let's Move the Needle. And Shannon's going to be a guest on this show coming up. So you were saying that you had met her. Oh, you went to the event and Gather Here. I was supposed to go, but then I was like, the traffic going into Cambridge. I don't know if I can handle it at 6 o'clock at night, so I didn't go. It's not terrible, but it's true. Oh my gosh, coming in from the western suburbs, I was like, I can't handle it. But I'm glad you went. How was it?
I did. Well, and it was wonderful, and it was fun because she was in conversation with Kari Williams, who's the author
His
of
book I also have. Yeah.
Oh, good. A Microactivism. And the two of them have been friends for a while. And and this is a great example of the craft category crossing over into other categories as well, in terms of, I think, both well-being and self-realization. I think this is, craft as a tool for self-realization and activism. And it was really a wonderful conversation. And I think that again, we're talking about craft, the trends in the craft community. I mean, kind of trends, and it's interesting to think back about, Kari Chapin and the whole burgeoning of the Etsy and online community. I think that Shannon is really paving the way with this book, with Let's Move the Needle, of really thinking more deeply about craft. As she says, she'll say it, I'm sure, when you talk with her, but rather than craft with a side of activism, the activism with craft as a tool, but one of your tools, but very focused on taking it, making sure that you're really getting results with what you're doing, and really activism. I really was impressed with her examination of activism and the different styles of activism, the different goals, and really understanding your goals and really getting deep into of really outlining your strategy. So it was a really exciting book for us to be able to do at Storey, and her own work is featured in the book. So it makes it very fun.
She, like you, has been a guest in the past and now is going to come back. And I have her book sitting on my staircase. So I need to dive in. I'm excited to read it. All right. So you have another recommendation. It's a hat pattern. I am not going to be able to pronounce this. Eilsberg Tory hat pattern.
Yeah. And this was, I just started getting into it. I really haven't done very much of intarsia and multi-strand multicolored knitting, but we were I was in Scotland this summer in July. We took a walking trip in Shetland, which was just fabulous, and the Shetland sheep were everywhere, and then I found that we weren't there for the Shetland Wool Week, but that one of the things that they do is have a pattern every year that everybody knits or can knit. And so I bought the kit for that, and I've been working on that, and it's really been fun to get into that. Yeah.
That's great. I love taking tours like that too. I think it's a great way to see something with a group of people and somebody who's knowledgeable. So that's awesome. And then white line woodblock printing. And we were just talking about this before we hit record, a workshop you took at Snow Farm Craft.
Yes. And it was a fabulous workshop with Lisa Hauk, who's been teaching this technique. And it's a way of creating a woodblock print like a Japanese print, but it was actually a technique developed in Provincetown in the 1930s. And I had seen an exhibit when I was out there at Provincetown, and a way of getting the multicolored print without having to carve multiple blocks and get them all registered, so that you carve the whole thing on a single wood block, and the white line contains different areas so that you can color it with watercolor. So there's a combination of integrating watercolor painting on the block, and you put your papers attached to the block. You just keep placing your paper down every time you apply a new color, and it automatically registers, and you fill out the picture. So I'm excited about continuing to do that. It doesn't require a press. It just requires wood, some wood cutting and watercolor, which I'm going to work on my watercolor skills more now too.
That sounds great though. And I love, I love taking a workshop or, learning from an expert. I think that's just like the best way to sort of fully immerse. And then you find later when you come home that you have all these new ideas based on what your skills and confidence even of being at the workshop.
Yeah. And being able to be with a group of people. It was 7 people, and all coming from different backgrounds in terms of familiarity with art and craft and different imagery that people chose to work on, and different techniques that emerge just within that small group over the course of 3 days. It was fun.
Totally. It's so nice. Well, congratulations on your retirement. I hope you get lots more workshops and tours and things coming up for you. And I hope we'll keep in touch. And it's just been great to sort of have a touch point about craft publishing at Storey through you all these years. So thank you for all of that as well.
Oh, you're welcome. And it's been wonderful to have connection with you and the whole craft community. So appreciative.
And you've been listening to the Craft Industry Alliance podcast. I'm Abby Glassenberg. Today's episode was brought to you by knitCompanion. knitCompanion's magic markers can find, color, and count all matching stitches with just a tap. Perfect to quickly see color combinations and patterns before swatching, changing pattern charts to match your yarn, and counting stitch runs. Magic markers work with any pattern. So check it out. Thank you so much, knitCompanion. Craft Industry Alliance is a community for craft professionals. When you become a member of Craft Industry Alliance, you get in-depth coverage of craft industry news, the opportunity to connect with fellow professionals for advice and support, and access to an educational library filled with ideas, tools, and resources to help you as you build your business. Join us at craftindustrｙalliance.org. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.